All right, so Mark Albins is an avid fisherman, scuba diver, and self-confessed fish nerd. He earned his bachelor's degree in biology with a minor in marine science from the University of Hawaii at Hilo. He went on to work for the National Marine Fisheries Service, conducting coral reef fish surveys in some of the most remote locations in the Pacific. Mark completed his graduate degree in marine biology under Professor Mark Hickson at Oregon State University, where his PhD dissertation focused on measuring the effects of invasive Indo-Pacific lionfish, which he will present on today, which are on native Atlantic reef fishes. Mark began working in the northern Gulf of Mexico in 2012 when he took a postdoctoral position at Auburn University. There he led efforts to quantify red snapper recruitment to artificial structures and collaborated on several related projects, including investigations of movement dynamics of red snapper and gray triggerfish and the use of hydroacoustics to quantify biomass of fishes on artificial reefs. Mark is currently working as a research associate and instructor in the Marine Sciences Department at the University of South Alabama, where he works hard to provide accurate and useful information to inform management, conservation, and restoration efforts in the northern Gulf of Mexico. He also teaches an intensive field-based undergraduate course in marine vertebrate zoology at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab and a graduate level course in experimental design and statistical analysis for marine ecology at the University of South Alabama. So thank you for joining us today, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. How are you guys doing today? Excellent. Good. Yeah, so unprecedented times these are that we're living in and operating in. Huh? You guys are having fun learning all this cool tech and having online meetings and stuff like that. I didn't really do much of this stuff until recently, and it's been a challenge, a steep learning curve, but we're all getting used to it, the new normal, right? So hopefully everybody's staying healthy and reasonably happy, and you guys are getting some good work done, even though things are weird. So yeah, my name is Mark Albins, and I'm at the University of South Alabama and at the Sea Lab, the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and I teach and I do research, and most of that stuff is focused on reef fishes. I do a little bit of other fish stuff. I do some inshore fish work and stuff like that, but mostly offshore reef fish work. What I heard through the grapevine from my wife, actually, who talked to you guys recently, that y'all are kind of interested in code and coding. And so just to kick off today, I thought I would show you R real quick, which is the coding tool that I use the most. And what you're looking at here on my screen is called R Studio. So this is the way people interface with R in a lot of different ways, but R Studio is my preferred way and a lot of people's preferred way. And essentially you just type your code in to this top left corner of the screen, you get output on the bottom right, and then you can get help files or see plots or all kinds of stuff down here. And you can see this is your kind of global environment or your workspace, your desktop, but you can see R is basically an object-oriented language. So you save objects and then work with them. You extract things out of them and do things with them. But I just wanted to show you something. R is really powerful with statistical analysis, but it's also really cool with graphing and graphics. And this is some code that I didn't write this code. I kind of stole it from somebody else and modified it a little bit to make a fractal. Does anybody know what a fractal is? You guys, I'm sure, have heard of fractals. They're these images that are created using mathematical formulae. And they're really cool because essentially they're infinite in both directions. They're infinitely large and infinitely small because the function that creates the image itself can go either way, infinitely small or infinitely large. So we can only like look at a slice of one at a time, but this is basically code to write a function that creates a fractal. And I use this in my introductory lecture on R and coding in R because it shows people that there's really simple ways of doing really complicated things with these kinds of tools. So we're gonna load a library. I think I have this library installed. Let's see. Yeah, that worked. And then run this code really quick. And what it's gonna do is write a file, write a GIF or a GIF file called Mandelbrot GIF. And I run that code and it's gonna take a little while. You can see it working now. It's Still working. I think it's almost done. Yeah, there it's done. Okay, so now let's open what we just created. Let's see, where is it? It's in the document. There it is. So we just created this file with that code that I ran, and now we're gonna look at the file, and it's a GIF file. So it's an image, but what it is kind of like an animated image of a fractal. And so what you can see is we're kind of like zooming in on the fractal, and you can see that it's getting more and more detailed around the edges. And the idea is that with one of these fractals, it gets, as the function progresses, as the function goes further and further, it goes from this simple result to a much more complicated result, and it can go that way infinitely. So this image can essentially theoretically get more and more detailed through the animation, and it's just kind of a fun thing that we do, that I show people that R can do, is create one of these fractal images. That's kind of fun stuff. And then I basically took that and made it I was giving this lecture during Valentine's Day, so I used that same code to create the final kind of last image of that fractal with a slightly different color scheme. It's taking a while to print it just because it's such a huge, there's so much, this is a huge file. It's like a 10 million cell spreadsheet that it's essentially plotting out on this graph. So a little happy Valentine's Day wish from me to my class back then. So I just thought I'd show you that a fun little example of what some of the things that you can do in R. Of course, R is really powerful for doing statistical analyses like linear regression, analyses of variance, and things like that. It can do just about anything you can imagine, and it's really the new kind of standard when it comes to statistical software packages or statistical software packages. This is what everybody's using these days. So fun stuff. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them later on. But what I'd like to do is start talking to you about my PhD research and some follow-up research that I've done kind of on the tails of that. After I left my PhD and progressed on in my career, I kind of kept one foot in the world of lionfish. And so I'm going to present to you my PhD dissertation research and then some other stuff added on to that. And mostly we're just going to kind of go through this talk and hit the high points. There's some really fun videos in here and some interesting stuff. The point that I want to start by saying that I would like you guys to interrupt me. If you have questions about something that I'm talking about or showing, just say, hey, hold on, can you go back to that slide, and I have a question about it. I'm totally happy to do that, and in fact, I think it makes things a little bit more interesting for folks. So please interrupt if you feel like it. Okay. So any questions before I start? All right, good deal. So the title of my talk is Invasive Pacific Lionfish, a Threat to Atlantic Reef Fish. And this is kind of the gist of where my research has focused, is on how lionfish may or may not be affecting native fishes. And I've done this work, I started doing this work at Oregon State University under an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship. And I did most of it at a place called Lee Stocking Island in the Bahamas at the Perry Institute for Marine Science. Since then, I've done some Sea Grant funded work with the University of South Florida, some work at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab with the University of South Alabama that I'll talk about. So I want to start today by sharing a little bit about why this is important to me personally, and why coral reefs and coral reef fish ecology is interesting, or a subject that I ended up dedicating a good chunk of my life to. And the reason is because coral reefs are amazing, right? They're the rainforests of the sea, people call them. They're just really, really interesting, amazing ecosystems, and they support the most diverse assemblages of vertebrates on the planet, right? So if you want to find the maximum number of species of vertebrate animals in the minimum amount of space on this planet, coral reefs are where you go to find them. And most of those vertebrates are fish. And I love fish. I love everything from the littlest, brightly colored aquarium fish all the way up to, big sport fish and stuff like that. But my true love is these little coral reef fish that live on reefs, and just the sheer diversity of that assemblage of species is really amazing. Unfortunately, a lot of reefs that once looked like this now look more like this, okay? And that's another reason I got into this stuff, is because I don't just see this as an amazing resource, an amazing ecosystem, an amazing part of nature, but I also see it as one that's currently undergoing massive destruction, massive die-off, massive extinction events. Okay, so these systems are disappearing from our planet, and I don't know if, I think I'll probably get to share these kinds of natural experiences with my daughters, but they probably won't get to share them with theirs, and that makes me sad. So why are coral reefs turning from these into this? Well, around the world, the problems are different, but the primary causes of biodiversity loss, at least on a global scale, involve what we've all heard of: climate change, global climate change, thermal stress, right? So the oceans get warmer, the warmer water stresses the corals, and the corals don't do as well. We've also got the coupled problem of ocean acidification, right? So the ocean water is not just getting warmer, it's also getting more acidic. Corals build their skeletons by sequestering calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate is something that can be dissolved, or it can not come out of solution as easily if the surrounding medium is more acidic. So this presents some problems for corals, right? On a more local scale, these are global threats. On a more local scale, we've got major pollution problems all around the world, especially in the tropics, especially in the coastal tropics. We've got really high population densities on very small islands in some cases, with a lot of people living near the coast. Almost all of the houses and people that live near the coast, their effluent, their poop, ends up in the ocean one way or another, in cesspools, things like that. We also have massive development on coasts around the world, and especially in the tropics. And whenever you have development, whenever you have heavy equipment moving earth and building things, you've got sediment problems. That sediment is terrible for corals, right? So we've got this combination of nutrients in the water through pollution from agricultural fertilizer, from human waste products, from all kinds of stuff. Those nutrients combined with a bunch of sediment going into the system, and what you end up with is often called a phase shift, where coral reefs go from coral-dominated systems to systems that become more and more dominated by leafy green or red or brown algae. Okay, so this is a shift that's happening across the world. In addition to that shift, which is affecting the kind of the basal habitat, the corals themselves in this ecosystem, we've also got the local effect of overfishing, right? There's, in the tropics, the biggest contributors to overfishing are the live aquarium fish trade and the live food fish trade. And the reasons these are so bad is because they both involve some really destructive fishing practices. So in both cases, for the live aquarium fish trade and the live food fish trade, a lot of fishermen use gill nets, which have a huge amount of bycatch, a huge percentage of fish die when they use gill nets. They also use chemicals and even explosives to get these fish out of the water alive. The problem is that all of these methods destroy coral. They all have a huge amount of bycatch and kill a lot of non-target species. So you've got some major impacts going on there. But what I'm going to talk about today, yes, go ahead.
Sorry. I had a quick question. So do you know what sort of chemicals they use in the last slide when they're catching those fish, and like what exactly they're using them for, like specifically?
Yes.
Like how they're catching fish with the chemicals?
Right. So most chemicals that they use are extremely toxic. People use cyanide, they use bleach, they use all kinds of stuff. And the idea is that if they use it in the right quantity or at the right dilution ratio, it basically will knock the fish out, and they can collect the fish more easily that way. And then they quickly put the fish in buckets with fresh water and basically revive them and then sell them in the aquarium trade or in the live food fish trade. The problem is if they get too much of a dose, they die. So they get a lot of death that way. And also, if they're trying to catch one particular valuable fish, they might kill 20 non-valuable fish getting to that one valuable one. So all different kinds of chemicals. And the idea is that if they get the right balance of toxicity, they can knock a fish out and still have it live or be able to be sold to the next step in the chain. Does that make sense? It's the same with the explosives. I mean,
Is that,
explosives,
yeah, is
obviously.
that not legal though in some?
So in some places, including the United States and most U.S. territories, and in Florida and in Hawaii, for example, fishing on the coral reef with cyanide is illegal. Fishing on the coral reef with explosives is illegal. But most of the coral reefs in this world are in third world countries. And a lot of those countries either don't have rules against this stuff or they don't enforce them. Everybody good with moving on? Okay, so this is setting the stage. What we're going to talk about today is something else. And you guys work in conservation and restoration work. So you may recognize some of the species on the slide right now. Does anybody recognize what all of these organisms have in common? You guys recognize any of these species in particular? Does anything jump out at you?
I see an ant.
An ant? Yep.
I see a clown.
Uh-huh.
Mm.
What do they all have in common?
They're
Johnny,
all
you raising your hand?
Invasives. They're all invasives.
Yes, very good. So all of these species, and there's a lot more than I've got on this graph, on this plot. These are just some very notorious individuals. But all of these species are invasive, which means we've moved them from their native, the place where they evolved, into a different system in which they didn't evolve. And in that new system, they have become problematic. They've caused problems. And some of these species have caused, billions of dollars of damage over the course of their invasion. And they're extremely expensive to mitigate, to eradicate. These are a big problem in a lot of terrestrial systems, a lot of aquatic systems. But typically in marine systems, we haven't seen as much of a problem with invasion. Well, that's kind of changed with this guy, right? This is who we're going to be talking about today. And this is a species that represents yet another threat to coral reef ecosystems because it is an invasive species. Indo-Pacific lionfish, or Pterois volitans, is native to the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific. They are carnivorous. They eat fish and crustaceans primarily. And they were introduced from the Pacific to the Atlantic in Southeast Florida sometime in the 1980s. How did they get there? Well, we think it was through the live aquarium, ornamental aquarium fish trade. Some lionfish were collected from the Indo-Pacific. Somebody stuck them in an aquarium in the United States somewhere. They got too big for that aquarium, and the person thought, oh, I'm gonna nice and free my fish into the ocean where it can go live a long life. The problem is they released it into the wrong ocean, okay? And that probably happened a lot more than once. Obviously, it happened enough for there to be a male and female that spawned successfully and had babies. But the gist of the story is lionfish made it from their home in the Indo-Pacific, probably through the aquarium trade, into the tropical Atlantic. But why are we worried about lionfish? Well, a lot of these reasons for concern were the subject of my PhD research, but also some of them I've addressed after my PhD was over, and some of them have been addressed by other people. Historically, before lionfish ever became a thing, we knew that freshwater fish invasions, especially when those invaders were predators, have been devastating. I don't know, have you guys ever heard of the Nile perch? Okay, have you ever heard of the African rift lakes? Okay, so there's some lakes in Africa that were formed by a rift in the continent. So there's this series of lakes, and they're these huge lakes. And basically, they were the home to some of the most amazing radiations of freshwater fish in the world. Cichlids, you probably heard of cichlids. They're a really popular aquarium fish for freshwater aquariums. Some of these lakes had 300 plus species of cichlids that all evolved from one species. So it was one of the most amazing modern or fairly modern evolutionary radiations of a vertebrate that we had an example of on the planet. Unfortunately, the Nile perch, which is a big predator species that was not in these lakes, was introduced to the lakes because people thought it would be a good food fish. Well, the Nile perch basically wiped out all of the native cichlids in a lot of the African rift lakes. And that process has been repeated around the world. So we know that predatory freshwater fish invasions can be devastating. We also saw that once lionfish were introduced, they spread very rapidly. And I'm going to show you an example of that next. So this is the first documented sighting just right next to Miami in 1985 of a lionfish. And what I'm going to do is hit the button and you'll see the year change. It'll start to animate and go 86, 87, 88. And you'll see these new red dots appear whenever a new lionfish sighting was reported. You can see that through the 80s, there was only one sighting, but in the early 90s, there started to be more sightings around Miami. By the late 90s, those sightings started to spread up that eastern seaboard of Florida. By 2004, all the way up to North Carolina and the Bahamas. And it's just this vast explosion after that across the whole, basically tropical Western Atlantic Ocean. So I don't have the last 3 years of data, but you can imagine that it's just more of the same. Lionfish basically all over the place. So we went from, 0 lionfish or 1 lionfish to this in what, the space of 20, 25 years or something like that, 30 years. So pretty amazing. Now we're going to focus on the coast, the northern Gulf of Mexico. In fact, right off Alabama, we have a zone called the Artificial Reef Permit Zone. Most of you that are fishermen know about this, but if you're not fishermen, you may not know about this. But essentially, right off the coast of Alabama, Dauphin Island is right up here above the screen, and Fort Morgan's right over here. But right off the coast of Alabama, there's this area called the Artificial Reef Permit Zone, where people have put, the state included, mostly the state, have put a bunch of artificial reefs out into the ocean to attract fish and to provide opportunities for fishing, mostly for red snapper. Well, lionfish love these artificial reefs. And we, in the Sean Powers lab at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, we basically have been going out to these reefs for a number of years and surveying for red snapper, gray snapper, other native species. In 2011, we didn't see any lionfish in the whole artificial reef permit zone. In 2012, we saw our first lionfish, and you can see that they were spread around the artificial reef permit zone. Whenever you see a white circle, that means there's lionfish on the reef, and the bigger the circle is, the more lionfish are on there. So we went from none in 2011 to a bunch in 2012, and then 2013, even more widespread with a couple sites with huge numbers of fish. 2014, again, even more widespread with fairly large numbers, and 2015, it just kind of goes off the chart, right? We're basically seeing a lionfish on every single reef that we've surveyed in the permit zone, with many reefs with, between 16 and 30 lionfish on a very small artificial reef. So the pattern that I'm showing you across the whole tropical and subtropical Western Atlantic is not just a pattern that we're seeing at a large scale, we're also seeing it if we look at small scales, and even in places here like Alabama. So where do we think lionfish are going to get to? That's a good question that people have asked. And the idea is that lionfish are probably limited by thermal tolerance. So they're a tropical species. And we know that they've made it all the way up to Cape Hatteras, but you can see that there's a distinct change here in the temperature, the warm water coming up from the Gulf Stream versus this cold water that's up in the New England area. So essentially lionfish can survive up to Cape Hatteras, and they will probably eventually make their way all the way down to somewhere around here in South America. We think Uruguay or something like that will probably be where the invasion will eventually stop. So this is not just an invasion that happened years ago. This is an invasion that's ongoing. Lionfish are currently at high densities here in the Caribbean, but they're also spreading down the coast of South America. The Amazon River pops out somewhere around here, and that may provide some kind of barrier to lionfish, but we think they'll probably make it past it. So this is the Kimball et al. And Morris and Whitfield basically said that they think lionfish will eventually make it all the way down to Uruguay. So rapid spread and broad spread of the species. We also see really high growth rates and high reproductive rates of lionfish. So juveniles, this is a little juvenile lionfish. You can see this, it's about 1 inch long at this point in its life. This is probably a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a week, between 1 and 2 weeks old. And these, at this stage in their life, they grow about 1 millimeter per day. So essentially when they first settle out of the plankton, lionfish are probably around 8 millimeters. And within 3 days, they'll be 11 millimeters, 3 more days, 15 millimeters, and they just keep getting bigger. It's really fast for a fish to grow that fast. They reach reproductive maturity at less than 1 year old, right? So when a lionfish comes in say August, and it's like this, by the next August, it's having its own baby, right? They spawn, once they're mature, the females spawn every 3 to 4 days, year round in the warm tropics. And every time they spawn, they release somewhere between 15 and 30,000 eggs. So you can imagine that, and they also live to be pretty old. So at 2 million eggs per female per year, we know that in captivity, lionfish reach about 35 years of age. They probably don't get that old in nature. They probably top out at 15 years or so, but that's still, almost 15 years worth of 2 million eggs per female per year, right? And lionfish have it's kind of a new concept for you guys, maybe for some of you anyway, maybe most of you. They have what's called a pelagic larval duration of 30 days. So most coral reef fish and a lot of fish have, when they spawn, they don't have babies that just swim on the reef with the moms and dads. Their babies are larvae, right? In fact, they often release their eggs into the open ocean. A few days later, the eggs hatch into little, almost microscopic little baby fish. And those fish don't live on the reef. They live as plankton in the open ocean. And so they can basically travel, right? There is, ocean currents and oceanographic processes can move those eggs and larvae around. So for about 30 days after the lionfish is born, it is floating in the water, able to travel long distances between islands if it catches the right current. That's the point of this, is that not only are they reproducing at this huge rate, but also they're spreading their larvae at a pretty good rate as well. So during the early part of the invasion, this is what our cumulative lionfish sightings looked like at our research sites in the Bahamas. Between 2005, when we saw the first lionfish, and 2009, we had this curve. You guys know what a curve like this is called? What's the mathematical formula that's going on here? Anybody know?
Exponential growth.
Right? So everybody says, would you rather have $1 million today, or would you rather have 1 penny today and then double that every day for a month? And the answer is you want the penny, right? Because the penny turns into 2 pennies, which turns into 4, which turns into 8. By the end of the month, you have like, I don't know, $2.5 million instead of $1 million. It's the same way with lionfish, right? One lionfish has 30 babies, and each of those babies has 30 babies. And pretty soon you've got this exponential growth curve. This is kind of textbook species population growth. We saw the same thing in the Turks and the Caicos. We saw the same thing in the northern Gulf of Mexico. We saw the same thing if you total up numbers across the invaded range with some variability. But in all cases, during these early years, we saw indications of exponential population growth, which is really interesting. If you do the math, if you actually look at the exponential growth curve, it works out to about 67% population growth rate, which is really, really big for a fish. Those are the plots. If you like to see pictures instead of plots, this is kind of a more visceral explanation of what I just said. So this is a video that was taken at a coral reef in the Bahamas in 2006, before the lionfish invasion. And what I want you to notice is all these little baby fish back here in the holes. There's some squirrel fish here. There's a nice angelfish, but look at all the little juvenile fish back here in the back of this cave. These are mostly grunts and snapper, but you can see probably 100, maybe, maybe somewhere between 50 and 100 juvenile fish back here in the back of this cave. Now we're going to go back to the exact same site 3 years later. Tell me what's changed.
There's no juveniles, and it's more of the
There's nothing but
fish eating.
Yeah, there's really nothing but lionfish. There's a few big fish swimming around, this big pork fish. There's like a big eel back in here that you can see if you look careful. There's a big grouper that swims by. But basically every single nook and cranny in this cave has got a lionfish in it. I think we counted 97 lionfish on that one rock in that one cave, where 3 years before there had been 0, right? And at the same time, we did surveys that showed that the juvenile abundance on those reefs was basically decimated. So this is a new predator on the reef that we're seeing, and we're seeing a lot less baby fish. What does that mean? They're eating them, right? It's pretty clear. So we're seeing these high growth and reproductive rates. We're seeing rapid spread. We're also seeing evidence of what we call ecological release. Now, ecological release means that a species that you take from the environment in which it evolved and you put it into a new environment, it's released. And the release comes in two forms. You can either be released because things that used to eat you aren't there anymore, or the things that could eat you don't know how, they don't recognize you as food. And the things that you eat don't recognize you as a predator. So ecological release means all of the things that were keeping your population small are released, because those interactions are not limiting anymore, because you can eat just about anything you see that you want to eat, and nothing eats you because you're a new player, right? You're a new species in the system, and you don't look like anything that anybody's ever seen before. So the predators don't eat you and the prey don't run away. And that means that you do better in the new system than you did in the old system. And the evidence that we see for that is that lionfish are reaching larger maximum sizes in the Atlantic than we see in the Pacific. They're getting bigger. They reach higher abundances in the Atlantic than they do in the Pacific. We've seen abundances over 400 lionfish per hectare, where in the Pacific it's usually more around less than 100 lionfish per hectare. So bigger sizes, higher abundances both suggest some kind of ecological release going on. This is a video footage that was taken, not by me, but I found it online. It was taken off of a wreck off of Pensacola. So this is right here in our neighborhood, guys. And these fish were not, this species was not in this ocean 3 years before this footage was taken. The densities that that lionfish are reaching on these reefs rivals that of native predators. So you see in the background a bunch of gray snapper swimming around. There's also red snapper. There's several native predators on these reefs, but lionfish in a few years have basically outnumbered the native predators on these reefs. And they're just amazingly abundant. This guy's removing lionfish. He's doing some volunteer lionfish spearing, basically. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So, evidence of ecological release. We also see that lionfish represent a new predator type in the invaded system. They're not just another grouper. They're a whole new type of predator. And to illustrate that, I'm going to show you some more video. This is video of a lionfish hunting. And basically, lionfish use those big, oversized, fan-like pectoral fins that you see to herd their prey into little corners and nooks and crannies of the reef. Once the prey doesn't have anywhere else to run, the lionfish strikes and swallows the prey. Right, so this is a new strategy. Using the pectoral fins to herd something around is not something that anything else in the Pacific does. Here's some nice slow motion footage of a lionfish swallowing a little baby fish. Kind of fun. This is my favorite, I think. You can really see, this is really interesting physiologically. You can see how a predator fish, works, how their mouth works and everything. So this is, let me just see if I can pause this for a second. So this footage right here is footage that I took in the Bahamas. I'm not as good a videographer as the guy who took the previous footage. But what I want you to see is there's a lionfish here. This is out on the natural coral reef. There's a lionfish here. What you can't see down here in the sand is there's a little goby, a little almost transparent little fish that lives in the sand sitting right here. And this is what we noticed this in the wild. This is something that was never documented before. But watch what this lionfish does as it approaches this little goby to try and eat it. You see it pulsing its gill covers and its mouth. It's like there's a pulsing thing going on. It's hovering and kind of doing like a little thing like this with its dorsal spines. But that pulsing thing we'd never seen before. We're like, what the heck are they doing? So we brought some lionfish into the aquarium and we put a little goby, the same kind of goby he was trying to eat earlier, into a tube. So the lionfish can see the goby can see the lionfish, but the lionfish can't eat the goby. Now look what's happening to these little grains of sand right here, right in line between the lionfish's mouth and the goby's head. See how those syngrins are dancing? So this pulsing that the lionfish is doing has a purpose, right? And here we basically stuck a pipette with some dye, some food coloring right in front of the lionfish's mouth. There's a little goby in a jar right here that he can see but can't get to. And you can see that I'll play that again real quick. He's basically blowing this directed jet of water right at the head of the goby. And again, this directed jet of water right at the head of this goby that he's trying to sneak up on and eat. This is kind of novel behavior. We haven't seen this in any other predatory fish before. So this is something that had never been documented. It wasn't in the literature for lionfish in their native range or in their invaded range. So I got together with a colleague, Patrick Lyons from at Stony Brook. I think he's moved on now. I'm not sure where he is, but we wrote a paper describing this behavior, this water jet blowing behavior of lionfish. So not only do they use these oversized pectoral fins to herd their prey, but they also use jets of water. What do you guys think they're doing? Why would a predator fish blow a jet of water at its prey? Any ideas? Any guesses?
Trying to make them go in a certain direction. Also like herding.
Yes. Try and make them face a certain direction. Maybe it has to do with the herding, right? So fish protect themselves with spines, right? Anybody who's ever handled a fish has probably gotten poked by a fish spines before. Most of those spines face backwards because most fish are attacked from the rear, right? The fish is swimming along, a predator comes from behind it and eats it from behind. Those backward facing spines make it hard for the predator to swallow the fish. So if you're a predator and you're sneaking up on a prey fish, maybe if you blow on it, you can get it to turn slowly and face you, and then you swallow it. And all the spines are facing away, right? That might make it easier to swallow prey. That was one of the things that we suggested in the paper that might be causing this. It's also possible that the jet of water confuses the prey's sensory system. So fish, I don't know how much basic fish biology you guys have, but fish sense predators based on vibrations in the water, right? Fish have what's called a lateral line system, and it senses vibrations in the water in a very sensitive way, to the point where if a predator actually strikes towards a fish, the fish can sense the pressure wave coming at it before the predator gets there, and it automatically turns and runs away without even thinking about it. The signal, it's been proven that the nervous signal goes directly from the lateral line to the muscles without even going to the fish's brain, which is pretty cool, right? So when a predator attacks, it creates this wave in front of it, and it automatically makes the fish swim away and turn away from that wave. That's a really well-known physiological reaction. So imagine now this is a lionfish, and instead of striking at the prey directly, it starts blowing this jet of water, gently at first, and then stronger and stronger and stronger. And those pulses of water mask the eventual pulse of the predator attacking, right? Because there's so much turbulent water flow going on, the lateral line is just kind of going haywire, and it can't cause that almost instant reaction signal to go to the muscles and cause the prey fish to swim away. So that was the other possible explanation for this. Nobody has done the research to show definitively what's going on in this situation, but really cool thing that we saw and published in Marine Biology, Journey of Coral Reefs. I can't remember where it's published, but it's up there somewhere. Okay, so novel predator type. They have few natural controls in the invaded range, right? So lionfish are literally bristling with venomous spines. These things are razor sharp. They've got a combination of a neurotoxin and a phytotoxin, so it's really nasty stuff. If you get stung by a lionfish, it hurts like the dickens, and I imagine that anything that tries to eat them, it hurts really bad too. So they're just not the top of anybody's menu, right? They're really nasty to deal with. And that being said, there have been a few documented cases of native grouper. This is a native Nassau grouper that have eaten lionfish in the invaded range, but very, very few and far between. And we also have evidence that this is called a gnathiid isopod. It's a fish predator, or a fish parasite, excuse me, that isopods and other parasites don't invade lionfish bodies or don't infect lionfish as often as they do native fish. So they're protected with venomous spines from native predators. They're also protected by some unknown mechanism from native parasites. So that means that they're basically free to do whatever they want, right? They have a strong effect on native fish. And this is where my PhD research focused. And what I did for my PhD research, among other things, is I set up an experiment on these. This is Least Stocking Island in the Bahamas. And right off Least Stocking Island is this array of experimental coral reefs that was set up by my previous advisor, Mark Hickson, and some of his colleagues back in the 1990s. And so when I started grad school, these were already set up. These are basically transplanted live coral patch reefs out in this open seagrass area with, you know, a good amount of space in between them. These are perfect for manipulating the density of fish. And so essentially what I did is I went out to these reefs. They look kind of like this. And I set up 4 different predator treatments. I set up a lionfish treatment, a grouper, native grouper treatment, a grouper plus lionfish treatment, and a control treatment with no added predators. And then I went back to those reefs. I had 5 of each type. I went back to those reefs over the course of the summer. So for about 2 months, I went back to every one of those reefs each week and counted the number of new baby fish that had shown up on that reef, right? So the net recruitment means you can think of it as the birth of new fish on that reef. They're not actually being born, they're coming and settling in out of the plankton. But essentially, if they survived on the reef, if they landed on the reef and then lived long enough for me to count them, they basically were counted in as net recruits to that reef. So this is what the control reefs look like. And this is exactly what you would expect, because the summertime in the Bahamas is when most recruitment happens. So the rest of the year, it kind of flattens out. But the idea is that you've got this big pulse of recruitment every summer when all the new baby fish come into the reef each year. Now, of course, there are other predators on this reef that are eating these baby fish, but those predators get basically swamped out and the baby fish numbers increase over the course of the summer and then plateau out kind of towards the end of the summer. So if we look at the same response variable on reefs that have a single small native grouper added to them, we see about a 36% reduction at the end of the summer in the number of new baby fish that showed up on these reefs. If we add a single small lionfish, in contrast, we see a 94% reduction in the baby fish accumulating on those reefs. If we look at the effect of both the native fish and the invasive predator together, we actually get a negative growth. So there are fewer baby fish at the end of the summer than we started with at the beginning of the summer. And the summer is supposed to be the time when all the baby fish are born, when all the baby fish come into the, right? So adding a lionfish to a system that's already got a grouper in it can be expected to change recruitment or the birth of fish on these reefs from a positive thing, about 40 on one of these small reefs over the course of the summer, to a negative thing, where there's actually fewer at the end of the summer than we started with, right? So that's pretty damaging. If we look at other response variables, this is the change in the number of species at the end of the study, the evenness and the diversity of those species. I won't go into how Pilot's J and Shannon's H prime are calculated, but these are different measures of diversity within the reef fish population on these reefs. And we see essentially that if we compare the native predator to the situation where we've got a native predator and a lionfish present, in all 3 cases, diversity goes down. And that's significant or close to significant in all 3 cases. So they're eating everything. They're eating all the baby fish. I think that's pretty clear. If they're eating all the baby fish, what's another problem that we might have?
Them outcompeting other fish that also, feed on baby fish.
Right. So the answer is right. I already gave you the answer. Competition. If you're eating all the food, all the baby fish are like popcorn to predators, right? If you're eating all the popcorn, nobody else gets any. And so if lionfish are having such a strong effect on the number of small baby fish on these reefs over time, they're probably taking that away, that food source away from other predator species. And this is a good example. This is basically a lionfish that we caught and noticed his tummy was kind of full. So we cut him open and counted up all the baby fish that he'd eaten recently. And basically this was all in the lionfish's stomach. It's really interesting because a lot of people do gut content analyses of predator fish and they often find fish with empty stomachs. Well, lionfish rarely have an empty stomach. They're almost always packed full with little baby fish. They eat a lot and they eat all the time. So that's just one example. I'm not going to go over these results. I think I'm going to skip over this part, but if you have questions about it, it's really interesting stuff. a graduate student that I worked on his committee did this work, and it was basically looking at the isotope ratios of delta C13 and delta N15 in lionfish versus a native predator on reefs. And what he found was a lot of evidence of competition between the two. I'm just going to skip over that because it takes a lot of time to explain those graphs. We're going to look at this graph real quick. This is kind of like the gist of what he found, was that so the light blue bars are on reefs with low lionfish densities, and the dark blue bars are on reefs or places where there's high lionfish densities. The bars represent the number of native grouper stomachs that contain invertebrate prey and teleost prey. And what you see here is that the only significant change between high and low lionfish abundance, when you have low lionfish abundance, the native grouper eats a lot more fish than when you have high lionfish abundance. So high lionfish abundance means the native grouper gets less fish food, less fish. So that was kind of the gist of his research. We also see possible cascading effects of lionfish. And I think I won't go over the data slides too much for this part, but I think that the intro slide is really interesting and neat to talk about. So coral reefs are really interesting ecosystems for a lot of reasons, partly because of the trophic structure. So we have typically our top predators like our sharks and our big grouper and stuff. Those usually eat what we call mesopredators, or medium-sized predators, smaller grouper, other predator fish like lizardfish and flounder and things like that, right? So we've got top predators, we've got mesopredators. The mesopredators often eat baby herbivorous fishes, so small fish that eat plants. The small fish that eat plants eat plants, they eat algae, right? And so we have this kind of negative effect of top predators on mesopredators, a negative effect of mesopredators on herbivores, and a negative effect of herbivores on algae. And essentially what that means is that the top predators keep the mesopredators down. And if they didn't, if the mesopredators were released from this predation pressure, they would basically decrease, if they were released, they would decrease the number of herbivorous fishes. And the decrease in herbivorous fishes would allow the algae to outcompete their competitors for space on the reef, which are the corals. And we talked about earlier about pollution, nutrient pollution and sediment pollution shifting coral reef systems from coral-dominated systems to algae-dominated systems. Another thing that can cause that shift or contribute to that shift is if you remove top predators from the system, you can have a trophic cascade that basically allows algae to outcompete corals. So the question is, and this is a fairly well-known phenomenon on coral reefs, but the question becomes, what happens when you add lionfish to this whole situation, right? And so the idea is that lionfish are mesopredators. They're a new, novel, very effective mesopredator in the system. So how do they affect this kind of triangle between herbivorous fishes, algae, and corals? That's the question. And so to answer that question, we did some experiments where we essentially looked at 3 different treatments with reefs with high lionfish densities with a lionfish present at the experimental site, treatments with reefs with high lionfish densities but with no lionfish directly present at the experimental site but with lionfish around, and then areas that had very few lionfish at all anywhere near the experimental site. Otherwise, these experimental sites were fairly similar, but essentially we took a little chunk of dead coral that was covered in algae and stuck it in front of a camera at these sites, and then took some time-lapse video. We also did some human counts of those too, but this is what the video looks like. Basically, little herbivorous fishes come in and pick the algae off of that dead piece of coral. The idea is that lionfish could affect herbivory rates in parrotfish and other herbivores on coral reefs, right? So what do we find? Well, if we look at the visitation rate to these little packets of yummy food of small fish and large fish, and we look at the percent visitation rates, so this is kind of a corrected visitation rate divided by the number of that type of fish that were found in a survey on the reef. What we see is that for the low, let me just click through these. So when lionfish density is low and there was no lionfish present, we see the highest visitation rate of herbivores to these little chunks of yummy food. When lionfish density is high, but they're not in the neighborhood, we see a medium level visitation rate. And when lionfish density is high and there's a lionfish right there present, we see the lowest rates of visitation to these chunks of food by herbivores. So the idea, and that's mirrored with large herbivores as well, small herbivores and large herbivores. We also looked at the percent loss in algae cover on these rocks as a function of their initial percent cover of algae. And essentially the story is that when lionfish are not around, as the initial percent cover increases, you get a higher percent loss in coral cover or in algae cover. So the idea is that the more algae you start with, the more of it gets removed. So the tastier the chunk of food is, the more things it attracts and the more things that eat. We see that relationship change when there are lionfish present, and even go almost completely away when a lionfish is present and there's a high density of lionfish on the reef. So you no longer have this kind of functional response between the initial percent of algae on a rock and the amount of algae that's removed by herbivores. So the idea is that lionfish eat baby fish, baby herbivores. So they have a consumptive effect on these species. And by eating the juveniles, they reduce the number of adults that survive, right? They can also reduce herbivory. So if lionfish just being around causes these fish to eat less food basically means lower survival and lower fitness. That means they're going to do less good at growing, less good at having babies, and even further decrease the numbers of herbivores. And this will probably have an effect that benefits algae and to the detriment of corals on coral reefs. Now, this is a lot of arm waving, and none of this has been proven completely by this study, but it's at least suggested that it could be a problem. Okay, so we all have to think about whether we want coral reefs to look like this or to look like this. And lionfish is one small part of that big picture that we all need to think about. I could talk about, I've got some other slides here that I could go into on more recent work and on control efforts and stuff like that. But I'd like to I'd like to just stop here and open up the floor to you guys if you have any questions. I think I've already gone a little bit long,
Yeah, that was really good. We do have some questions in the chat box, but most of them are kind of going around this like one topic, which is what are some of the solutions for dealing with lionfish?
Okay, that's a great question because that's my next slide. So what can we do about it, right? What about eradication? Can we just go out and kill them all? Can we just get rid of them, pull them out of the ocean? Well, I'll remind you, this is what the map of sightings looks like, right? They're all over the place. And they're not just all over the place in shallow water. This is footage that was taken from a submersible in 1,000 feet deep in the Bahamas. So lionfish probably reach their highest abundances in fairly shallow water, but they're also making it down to really, really deep water. So you can't dive to these depths, right? So even if you could send an army of spear fishermen out to kill them all, they can't get all of them. And there will always be some refuge in deep water that they can come back from. There are some ideas about using traps to catch them in deep water, but then you've got bycatch problems and all kinds of stuff. So there's lots of problems with eradication. I think eradication is pretty much off the table. What about protecting biocontrols? Are there any native species that might eat them or might someday learn to eat them? Well, interestingly, Nassau grouper, which I mentioned earlier as being one of the only fish to have documented predation on lionfish, this is a Nassau grouper eating a dead lionfish out of a scuba diver's hand. And so it's kind of a fun video, and it doesn't really prove that they will eat them in the wild, but what it does prove is that this grouper actually comes back over and over again and eats a dead lionfish like almost every week. So the point of that is that we know physiologically they can tolerate the spines and the toxin and everything and be fine and live for a long period of time. So they do have the potential to eat them. So the problem is that most of these apex predators like Nassau grouper are threatened throughout the lionfish range. They're threatened by overfishing, right? Just about anything we can think of that likes to eat lionfish, we also like to eat it. So we thus overfish them. So I think along those lines, marine protected areas and fishing restrictions are probably our best bet to protect potential biocontrols, which are native apex predators. What about local mitigation via focused removals? Can we just go to one specific sensitive site and remove all the lionfish every so often and keep maybe once a year or something and keep that reef healthy and clean of lionfish. Well, that's something that we've done a project on, and I'm going to click through. A lot of this is, you're going to go to the end results, which is essentially this. So we compared control reefs to 4-month removals. So in other words, divers went to this reef every 4 months and removed all the lionfish they could find, and 1-month removals. And the 4-month removals had no significant effect on the density of lionfish or the biomass of lionfish. If you send divers out there every single month to remove all the lionfish they see, then you can have an effect on their density, but not on their biomass. So even intensive removals on a fairly limited spatial scale are not very effective, these guys. What about getting the public involved, derbies, tournaments, etc.? These are small scale efforts, they're short-term efficacy. Interest will probably decrease over time for the whole lionfish thing. So what about commercial fishing? We're really good at overfishing things. Why can't we just overfish lionfish, right? The problem is that that kind of fishing is driven by economics and not conservation. So once a fish becomes depleted to the point of economic extinction, I believe they call it economic extinction, that means there's still more fish out there, but there's not enough of them for it to make sense for you to spend the gas to go get them to sell them, right? And so the idea is that commercial fishing could drive lionfish to commercial extinction, but probably not biological extinction. And then as soon as it's released, they would come back, they would bounce back. So it's definitely an option, and I have no problem with encouraging people to buy lionfish and cook lionfish and sell lionfish. The problem is that you also create a group of stakeholders with a vested interest in the invasive species and in keeping it around. Because once people shift effort to lionfish, they won't want to shift it away again, right? I mean, people get into their ruts, and if a guy gets successful with lionfish, he's not going to want to stop fishing them. So now you create stakeholders that have a vested interest on the opposite side of the situation. Deep water fishing requires traps. Traps have high bycatch. I think the best way of reducing lionfish abundance and mitigating their effects on native systems is through focused, ongoing, intensive removals by management agencies. And that's sad because it's not that effective, it's really expensive, and it's an ongoing thing that has to basically happen, or we have to just give up. Those are the only choices, which is sad. The nice thing about our area is artificial reefs are really easy targets. Lionfish seem to be clumped up on artificial reefs, and you can just go to the reef and basically spear everything off the reef and get them really easily. What can you do? You can learn about invasive species. You can teach other people about the damage that invasive species can cause. We can hopefully avoid introducing the next lionfish. We can avoid exotic pets. We can avoid hitchhikers by cleaning the bottoms of our boats, the bilges of our boats, things like that, and support invasive species programs. And of course, we all vote, right? So vote for politicians that are sensitive to these kinds of things, because policy is important, right? And that's the end of my answer to that question.
Yeah, did anyone else have any question they wanted to ask? Go ahead, Forrest.
Hey, I was wondering if you've experienced a lot of like the lionfish around artificial reefs, or do they usually avoid those?
Lionfish love artificial reefs. Lionfish and artificial reefs are like peanut butter and jelly. Love them.
Okay.
Yeah. The more, I think.
I was just wondering, maybe they didn't like them.
No, they do. They love them. In fact, there's at least one paper out there that has shown fairly convincing evidence that artificial reefs facilitate invasion by lionfish. They make it easier for lionfish to invade an area by giving them an easy foothold. Lionfish really like vertical structure. They like anything that sticks up high above the ground, and artificial reefs do that more than natural reefs in general. So.
All right, thank you.
And I think, Austin, did you have a question?
I wanted to ask, how's the process to just ban them in stores? Because it's certainly alarming that I can still see them for sale here locally.
Yes. Yeah, you know, I don't have a good answer to that. I don't know what I think different policies on importing exotic species are based on different states, and different states have different attitudes toward it, and different rules and regulations. And I'm not sure what, I know that in Florida, it's a big deal because you've got stakeholders on both sides. Florida is one of the main places where aquaculture for the aquarium fish industry happens, and those guys don't want to be regulated too much. They want to be able to import and export things for their industry. So it's hard for, there's a lobby with that group, and the lobby has a lot to do with the University of Florida and some of the programs they have there, which have to do with the aquarium, the ornamental aquarium industry. So it's a big political morass. So yeah, I don't know how to, I mean, you would like to think that when there's something this obviously wrong, people would just make a law that would, you know, help it to be better in the future, but it's not the case.
Haley asked if they had any natural predators in their native ocean, like in the Pacific.
Great question. There's not good documentation of it. When we first started to notice lionfish as a problem, the first thing we did was say, oh my gosh, what eats them in their native range, and started to look for papers that documented it, and there are very few. We think that grouper and, you know, small reef sharks and stuff like that probably eat them fairly regularly over there because they recognize them as a prey item. And like I said, they are able to physiologically eat them. They're still probably kind of like the thing you eat if you can't get anything else, right? So not too many people will choose, you know, the cactus when they can choose the apple, right? It's like the difference between an apple and a cactus. I don't want to bite the cactus. So unless I'm really hungry, I'm not going to go for the cactus.
Did anyone else have any last minute questions? I know for me, I was wondering if, like, say the volunteer effort and like the different methods of like kind of eradicating them, it doesn't really work, but does it slow it down to a point where, is there any hope for like the native species adapting to this new predator, or fish realizing that's something they could eat? Or is like, yeah, I was wondering on that side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of jaded and a little bit negative at the end of this talk, and I apologize for that because I don't like to be on that side of things. I think it's great for people to go out and, you know, participate in derbies and stuff like that and spear as many lionfish as they can. I think there's nothing wrong with that. There are some maybe animal rights issues if you're into that kind of thing, but I think that kill lionfish, kill them all, you know, like eat them. They're great. They're great. They taste really good. They're beautiful though, right? So it's kind of sad. Like, I love lionfish. I just wish they weren't in the Atlantic. So I'm kind of torn on that one. But I think that if the volunteer efforts, the derbies, things like that can't hurt, and they can possibly help. Yeah, they can do a little bit of good here and there.